In government the other day, we were instructed to look up a Supreme Court case and talk about the topic, the verdict, and what it means for the future.
We're sitting here right now looking at the Miranda v. Arizona case, where Ernesto Miranda was arrested and questioned by police officers. After 2 hours of interrogation, the police obtained a written confession from Miranda. The written confession was admitted into evidence at trial, despite the objection of the defense attorney and the fact that the police officers admitted that they had not advised Miranda of his right to have an attorney present during the interrogation. The jury found Miranda guilty, and after being affirmed in the Supreme Court of Arizona, the Supreme Court of the United States ended up ruling that this violated his Fifth Amendment rights.
This reminds us of the interrogation and confession in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Except, at the time, there were no laws surrounding the circumstance of confession in Russia, where the book takes place.
Hi, I'm Ava.
Hi, I'm Senia. And this is Expectation Escapades.
In today's episode, we'll be analyzing 3 characters in Crime and Punishment,
Discussing the decisions they made,
why they made them,
and breaking apart every piece of them until we are all left with a greater understanding of the book as a whole.
Okay, so the first and pretty obvious thing to start with would be Raskolnikov and his decision to kill Alyona and Lizaveta. So, Senia, what were your thoughts when you were reading that section of the book? Why do you think he decided to do it at that moment? And did your opinions about it change as you were reading the book?
Yeah, so I think that his decision to kill Alyona and Lizaveta is really the starting point of every other bad thing that happens in the book. He explains pretty well why he decided to kill them in his conversation with Sonia. He, basically felt like he had nothing else to do in order to fix his poverty situation. He just felt so helpless and so, in debt and just terrible that he thought that he needed to kill Alyona, but then ended up killing Lizaveta later because that was the only thing that seemed like it could help him in the end.
Yeah, and I think that actually is really important. It's a really important theme throughout the book, is the idea of control, because Raskolnikov, he thought he was in control by killing Alyona, but really, if we look at it, he's really not, because he goes to this place, he hears someone talking about wishing that Alyona was dead because, she's not a great person, and he gets upset because he wants to have that idea, so he decides to kill Alyona himself. So he thought that he was in control in that, but the real point that took him out of control was killing Lizaveta, and that was the part, as we could see, later on, that he was the most torn about. He felt terrible about, when he thought about it later, he pretty much only thought about killing Lizaveta because he had already rationalized killing Alyona in his mind, but Lizaveta just took out all the control from him, and it kind of goes along with his theory of the extraordinary man, which is a big theme in the book, but I guess we can start talking about it now. That he was kind of he wanted to prove or see if he was an extraordinary man. He wanted to believe that he was. And I think that the fact that he killed Lizaveta and got out of control, is maybe something that was showing him that, yeah, maybe he's not really the extraordinary man that he wants to be.
Yeah, I think a lot of times there is that thin line that you just cross. Once you kill somebody, you are able to kill other people. It's a line that you can't come back from. And I think that a lot of times we forget that Raskolnikov is a perfectionist in many ways. And so when he came up with this great, crazy, extraordinary plan to kill Alyona, and it was all perfect, and he had everything set up, and he knew when to walk in and what weapon he was going to use, and then Lizaveta kind of came and ruined everything. And so in the mind of an already kind of disturbed person, when their grand scheme is ruined, then they're going to take an even deeper nosedive. And I think that kind of leads us into talking about his morals, which were really just torn apart, from the inside out after he decided that he was going to kill Aliona, and when he did kill Lizaveta.
Yeah, and I think that's something that he really struggles with the entire time because he's going through this internal battle, but we also see how he's treating other people, which a lot of the times it's pretty terrible. He's really not even regarding that they're there. He's kind of just focused on himself. You can see that he wants to be kind of his own person in the way that, oh, like he's the extraordinary man because he is, he doesn't have to worry about these things. But we also see some moments that he is caring. He's really wrestling with these feelings, especially I think you can see it when he's with his mom and his sister because he does care about them, I think. Just, shows in different ways throughout the book. But I think his mental state at that time really has a lot to do with his decisions and the way that he treats other people. And I think another thought that I was thinking about is he good or evil? And obviously those are hard words to define and there's nothing exact about that, but what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that adding on to that level of him transcending morals, he also transcends the bounds of good or evil, because in our minds, when we think about good or evil, evil can mean many things. The evil for me may be different, and different type of evil for you. In the scope of the book, those around him seem to be disagreeing on what's good or evil. When Rasmukin is trying to rationalize how Raskolnikov is acting, he says, well, you must be mad because he can't even conceptualize someone doing something so evil. And when just in general, when we're talking about when someone is going past the bounds of morals, to them, they might be doing good, Like in Raskolnikov's mind, he's still in the right. He has his doubts, but he does feel he's in the right. And it's not until much later that he kind of gives another perspective to that.
Yeah, and I think whether or not his thought process and thinking, oh, he is right, it's definitely an interesting thing to look at throughout the book because he obviously has his doubts. He's obviously wrestling with this thought, the thought of him doing this crime so much in his mind, which is why he goes to confess so many times. He's, going crazy because he can't really deal with the mental, strain that this has put on him, which, I think that's definitely a main aspect of the book is how he's dealing with this mentally.
So, as we're talking about choices, I can't help but think the choices that Sonia made for her family. So, what are your thoughts on that? She made so many choices that were against her moral code, and I can't help but wonder what she was thinking.
Yeah, definitely. So, Sonia is a very religious character, and not only is she religious, but in my opinion, she's presented as kind of godlike. She's very, very different from Raskolnikov in the way that she's presented. So, she obviously has these religious views, but she is a prostitute, and at that time it was probably looked down upon by other people, especially in religion. But then on the other hand, she was making the choice for her family. I mean, she was in a terrible circumstance. She had her dad, out of control, stealing money from her and then dying. So she needed to make this choice. So she was, choosing between caring for her family and not letting them down and, becoming a prostitute or is kind of saving her own reputation in that way. And she chose saving her family, which I think was really interesting. And I think they did that on purpose to add even more to her character. I think that idea that she's presented as so caring about other people shows a lot about Raskolnikov and Sonia's relationship. So what do you think about their relationship? Because I guess we have her morals by herself, but their relationship is, even more interesting, I feel like, and the dynamic that they have because they're so different.
Their relationship, in many ways, it just makes me think about the idea of Sonia saving her family and kind of giving up everything to save her family. And being the religious person that she is, I almost have to wonder if when she decides to kind of help Raskolnikov to see God and, and tries to urge him to confess, if that's a way for her to help herself, and help her the way she views herself in a religious context. And they had a friendship beforehand. It's a very unlikely friendship when you think about it. They come from different types of families. Sonia's family used to be at some point respectable, and then it just kind of all went downhill. And then Raskolnikov, obviously, he's dealing with his own stuff with his mother and his sister, but they both find each other because I think they both recognize in each other that need to do something to either help themselves or help their family that maybe not everybody understands, but they understand, and they can rationalize that within themselves, and that's okay.
Yeah, definitely. And that made me think about, in my opinion, one of the most interesting parts of the book in their relationship, which is the part where Raskolnikov, kind of gives her three options that he thinks will happen to her. When he thinks something, we see throughout the book that he kind of doesn't really give it up. And so he has these ideas of what will happen to Sonia, and she says, "No, that's not going to happen to me because God won't let that happen to me. God won't let that happen to my family." And I think that's a really interesting part and shows a lot about their dynamic, their differences, and how they act around each other, I guess.
Yeah, I completely agree. They kind of go in circles around each other. They're two sides of the same coin, I would say, is like just a great way to compare them. And especially, given that Sonia is a woman. I mean, she really is almost the opposite and the same of Raskolnikov in every way.
Okay, so moving on from Sonia to another character who's very interesting is Razumikin. So I just wanted to get your thoughts. What are your opinions on, his morals and his choices throughout the book?
I mean, when you think about Razumikin as after talking about Raskolnikov and Sonia, he seems like, such an almost bland option and thing to talk about. He has very generic morals. And that's not necessarily to say that they're bad. He has very black and white views on what is good, what is evil. He's very humble, and that's something that we always see. He wants to help people. But because he sees things through these narrow lenses of his morals, that's why it's so hard for him to understand people like Raskolnikov, who don't fit into these boxes that he creates for the different people in his world.
Yeah, and I think kind of about that. He has these, very clear ideas of what's good and bad, like you said. And so, one of the first times that we really see feeling or an emotion from Razumikin is the chapter where he first realizes that he has feelings for Dunya, Raskolnikov's sister. And I think that part is really interesting because I think, he's drunk and he's saying things that, compared to other things in the book that we've seen, things that Raskolnikov has done, other people, they're not that bad, in my opinion. But when he is kind of out of this the next day, he's really taken back by what he said. He's going a little bit crazy because it's very out of character for him. Like I said, we haven't seen at this point anything like this from Razumikin, but it's showing him straying away from this idea of, being perfect. He's, the whole thing about him giving things to Raskolnikov all the time, no matter what his situation is. We don't really know Razumikin's situation that well, but he is giving clothes and money and everything to Raskolnikov, who isn't really paying him any attention, but he has just been there for Raskolnikov this whole time.
Right. And it's refreshing, I think, thinking about the way that he reacted or the way that he talked about Dunya and the way that he reacted afterwards, because without that, I don't think we would have really seen Rasmussen as human like the rest of the characters in the book. Because up until that moment, there had been no flaws to Rasmussen. I mean, you could argue that maybe Rasmussen was flawed in the way that he kind of always was acted like he was a hero of the people, but then that makes me think of another character, Svi Jugailov, and the way that he rubbed Raskolnikov the wrong way because he felt like he could buy people's affection. So he's definitely a very complex character. I can't say I completely can't find any faults with him, but at the same time, given all the other characters who have done some very questionable things, he's probably one of the more agreeable ones. So talking about their morals, all three of these characters use their morals in very specific ways to kind of excuse and give reason to their behavior. So they do it in various ways that differ greatly. So what are some ways that you think that you see these characters do that?
Yeah, so the first thing that comes to my mind is Raskolnikov and how he uses his theory, the extraordinary man theory, and also his kind of lack of morals to ignore his own behavior because he doesn't really know any other way to deal with it. So, going back to his extraordinary man theory, he believes that an extraordinary man has the right to commit any crime that he wants or transgress the law in any way that he wants because he's extraordinary. And I think that's something that he's trying to test when he commits the murders, but he's also using this to excuse his own behaviors. And I think that's really interesting, even though we see throughout the book that his thoughts about whether he is or is not an extraordinary man, it kind of varies throughout the book, but all this time he's still using it to excuse his own behaviors. So, do you have another idea about another character that you were thinking about, kind of excuses for their behaviors?
Yeah. So, I think that Sonia uses her religion a lot, not necessarily to excuse her prostitution, but to make herself seem forgivable. I mean, she mentions many times in the book that she hates prostituting herself, and she does not like the idea of prostitution. But in many ways, she knows that she has to do, or she feels that she has to do it to keep her family afloat and to save her family. And she also recognizes that because, she's so devoted to God and his message, she feels that that's enough to forgive her for her sins. And we see this type of forgiveness of sins again when she talks to Raskolnikov and tries to convince him to confess, because in her mind, no matter how bad of a crime you may commit, as long as you show your vulnerability to God, your name will at least be cleared in one sense. And then just going back to Raskolnikov really quickly, I mean, his ideas of the extraordinary man, it just can lead to such dangerous thought. I mean, essentially Raskolnikov is like teetering on nihilism and anarchy. I mean, because he views himself as extraordinary, and because he is extraordinary, he doesn't have to have any morals. He doesn't even have to think about the actions that he makes. I mean, he literally ignores every single behavior or every single code or law that he may have to be bound to. And so he doesn't even have to excuse his behavior, because in his mind, it doesn't need to be excused. He can do whatever he wants, Like when he is being rude to someone or ignoring his friends, and when he was trying to justify killing, it wasn't like he had to. I mean, yes, he did try to rationalize it, but once he crossed a certain point, it wasn't even like he needed to rationalize it. It was just, I'm extraordinary. I killed this woman because it needed to be done. Like, who am I going to apologize to? Yeah. And it wasn't until later when Sonia talked to him and, kind of convinced him of her own religious beliefs that he really thought different about that.
Yeah, I think kind of relating to Raskolnikov not even really thinking about his own actions or behavior, that makes me think of Razumikin, because he kind of uses his idealized morals, his views, to also kind of ignore that behavior. I mean, we know that he sees it, but that doesn't stop him from being kind to him, seeing the best in him, which isn't a bad thing, but it's in my opinion, but it's still interesting to see how his morals are playing out in this relationship, because he's not maybe as concerned as he could be. And by concerned in this way, I mean a little more like trying to pull away from this friendship. Instead, he's caring a lot about him. So it's different than Sonia and Raskolnikov, because, he's not really excusing something bad that he did or something bad that, he thinks that other people will think of him, but he is kind of using these ideas to maybe excuse Raskolnikov's behavior. And I think that could be definitely up for debate, but I think it's definitely something interesting to think about. So,
yeah, I 100% agree. I think that, when you think about or going back to that thought about him having these boxes that he fits people in, instead of using his morals to excuse his own behavior, he's using his morals to excuse other people's behaviors that he can't understand. When he's talking about how he's so confused by Raskolnikov and his actions, and he's like, well, you either have to be evil or you have to be mad, because he can't conceptualize it in any other way. He doesn't understand the theory of extraordinary man. And in many ways, you wouldn't be able to understand that theory except from a third person view, as we are able to see it. If we saw someone and they were saying the things that Raskolnikov was saying and doing the things that he were doing, I mean, most people would take on Rasmukin's point of view, being like, well, he has to be either insane or he has to be evil, because that doesn't make any sense, because we, in many ways, Rasmukin is a reflection of our society right now and what our society's idealized morals are. And I think that's why he's such a good character for us to latch onto, and why we all kind of root for him and feel for him, because we have the same views as him. So he almost represents the reader in this case, like just always trying to analyze, always trying to fit the people that he meets into different boxes.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And going back to your point about confusion, how he can't really accept this. He doesn't know how. I feel like we can also look at that from Sonia's point of view, because Sonia is also confused, in my opinion, but she reacts to it differently. How she reacts, she is immediately latching on to what she knows best, and that's God. So she is using her confusion to be like, to Raskolnikov, you should take this to God. Like, it will make you a better person. So I think the difference between the two is very interesting to see how they deal with their confusion and how they use their morals in that sense. So we've mentioned this a few times before, but one of the major themes of the book is poverty, and we thought it would be interesting to analyze each character and how they react to poverty in the book and their situation.
To give depth to this conversation, we talked to Roper history teacher Max Collins, who has a PhD in Russian history and spent several years in Russia.
The peasantry are they get the land, but they have to pay for it. And there's a redistribution of land that often doesn't help them out that much. So they are essentially still in a fundamentally very difficult economic situation. And so, rural poverty is pretty much common to them. They just tend to be poor. If you compare Russian peasants to Western peasants in France or Britain, things like that. I mean, generally peasants are poor, but they're significantly worse off in Russia, partly because of the land shortage. Agricultural practices tend to be more primitive in a number of ways, and that undermines the productivity. So there's just less stuff being produced.
So, like Max mentioned, poverty in Russia could often seem inescapable. When you think about Raskolnikov and the way that he did the extreme reaction of killing to deal with his impoverished situation, that really shows. He did one of the ultimate evils as a reaction to his, lack of funds and just basic human living conditions. And then it also makes you think about poverty in general and whether it's a physical construct or if it's something that we create in our own minds, because it almost works for Raskolnikov by killing, even though he goes on this whole mental journey and he doesn't really know what his next move is. He never actually thinks about his impoverished situation for the rest of the book. What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and I think that goes back to what we've been mentioning before, which is the extraordinary man theory that Raskolnikov has. He views himself as above this, and by killing Alyona and Lizaveta, he's trying to prove if he's this extraordinary man, kind of above the rest of humanity, he can do different things. And as a reaction to that, and kind of along with that, is, he can be above poverty. He's not even thinking about it, like you said. And I thought that was a really interesting part of the book. And this also reminds me of this scene with Katerina at Marmeladov's funeral, where Raskolnikov comes in and Katerina mentions how he's pretty much the only respectable one there, which, in my opinion, was a little bit shocking considering Raskolnikov's state, which he is poor, but it doesn't really seem as though he's in the same situation as everyone else, who just seems more poor with him, even though we know his situation. We know that he isn't paying his rent, he doesn't have money. So I thought that was a really interesting part.
Definitely. To give us a clearer view on how people could be viewed as both aristocratic and impoverished, Max Collins tells us this.
Here's another kind of famous tidbit that you might know about already. It's kind of a famous thing about 19th century Russia and poverty, etc. Mm-hmm. And that is the Russian aristocracy, unlike the British aristocracy, which is basically a wealthy bunch of people in Britain, right? Yeah. And the Russian aristocracy is very diverse in a number of ways, but also economically, right? Yeah. Partly the land situation wasn't very good, mm-hmm. In ways that I've described earlier. Partly this had to do with the fact that in Russia, like quite a number of other European countries, typically land would get divided, right, mm-hmm. Among the upper class. So you might start off with a big estate, but then over the generations, this would get divided and divided. And you ultimately had, it was not unusual to have members of the upper class, mm-hmm. People who would be considered aristocrats or gentry, who were essentially poor. Mm-hmm. And if you read accounts of the Russian countryside by, say, British travelers back in that era, 18th and 19th century, one of the things they'll notice this is kind of the poor gentry, and say they'll be going through a village and they'll see a bunch of peasants having a conversation. Mm-hmm. But as you watched, you'd observe that actually there was one peasant, and then the other peasants were kind of deferential to that peasant. Yeah. And then you'd look a little closer, you find out that the peasant wasn't a peasant. He was, mm-hmm. An aristocrat, but poor, right? Mm-hmm. Clothing was pretty much the same, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So the Russian aristocracy in the 19th century is definitely characterized by significant poverty, or you get sort of a middling aristocracy that's got to hustle, right, and is experiencing quite a bit of economic insecurity.
So this bit of historical background can definitely tell us a lot about Raskolnikov's situation, because even though he is extremely poor, he doesn't have money, he can still be viewed as aristocratic, which we definitely see throughout the book.
Yeah, and one of the main characters that we see this in is Sonia, who, even though is the daughter of Katerina and is a part of that family, we don't associate her with the wealth of her family at all. When her dad stole her money and she ended up prostituting herself for that, in that moment, she separated herself from every connection that she had to her family in a social sense. And, she feels terrible, as we mentioned earlier, with having to prostitute herself, and she hates it, and she uses her morals to kind of excuse her for that. But it can often seem, as we watch Sonia throughout the book, that even that isn't enough. And it almost seems like she is almost the worst off, even worse than Raskolnikov in her situation, because Raskolnikov has the blessing of being able to be blissfully unaware of a lot of his situations. Well, everything for Sonia is like a sharp reality. And it almost makes you think if Raskolnikov's great act of the extraordinary man was an act of privilege. Because even though we can all recognize that he might not have been in the right mindset, and he definitely isn't for the rest of the book, the fact that at some point he even had the notion that he could and was able to, abandon all his morals and give up all responsibilities. I mean, that's a privileged way of thinking. No matter how skewed his mind may be, he's showing his privilege while doing that, because Sonia could never do that, and if she did, her family would crash and burn, and she knows that. Well, Raskolnikov, he does, kind of deal with the guilt of what his sister went through, and, what his mother is going through. In the end, they're going to be okay, because they have friends like Razmukin to help them.
Going back to what we were talking about earlier about how Raskolnikov is able to kind of hold himself above these responsibilities, in my opinion, has to do with one of his major character traits, I guess, which is his mental health, or his lack of mental health resources.
Roper history teacher Mike Ruddy talked to us about mental health resources in Russia, giving us a better understanding of why Raskolnikov was able to spiral so terribly without any proper help.
Just to your knowledge, do you know if there were any mental health resources at the time?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I can't say there were, there weren't, but I think that in Western Europe, mental health really only became something significantly addressed. I mean, other than just, here, let's lock people up. Something's wrong with them, we'll lock them up until they get better, if they ever do. Mm-hmm. Probably in the final third of the 19th century in Western Europe, and so I'd say in Russia, it probably really wasn't until, maybe the last 2 decades, till the 1880s.
Another thing that Raskolnikov seems to struggle with internally, especially after meeting Sonia, is his religion. Mike explains the etymology of his name, helping us understand this a little bit better.
So Raskol is basically someone who is a religious dissenter, that the Orthodox Church split in the 1600s, and unlike the Western Christian Church, most of the people stayed with the Orthodox Church in Moscow. Mm-hmm. It was people who split and would have in Western Europe or in Western Europe formed new sects. Well, they did form new sects, but they were basically like old believers. We think they've made a couple of doctrinal changes, which is going to break the church. And so people often, and were people who are these Raskol, or split, literally division, the Raskolniks, some of them went to more remote places into Siberia. Others migrated to places in Eastern Europe where there wasn't Russian government policy. But I should say that Dostoevsky himself was really somebody who was he was still within the Orthodox tradition, but he was certainly a skeptic in many ways.
Continuing on the topic of lack of mental health resources in Russia at this time, we see Razumikin throughout the book struggle with how to react and how to help Raskolnikov throughout his various mental health issues.
And in many ways, Razumikin is the antithesis of both Raskolnikov and Sonia in terms of the way that he views poverty. And he's so different because he is one of the only characters in the book who is not actively trying to escape poverty. In many ways, he's the only one who might be truly happy. And, we see Raskolnikov struggle so much to try to understand the mechanics of the way Raskolnikov is thinking, and he tries so hard to be perfect, which he also explored earlier. But he really does try to find that silver lining, and that's a sentiment that we don't see in anybody else.
Yeah, I completely agree. And another thing that I think is really interesting to look at throughout the book is the ways in which different characters give away their money and give away their things. We see Raskolnikov do it, but in my opinion, it's different than Razumikin because Raskolnikov really needs that money. He's behind on his rent. He's not paying it. Razumikin, on the other hand, gives Raskolnikov clothes, gives him money, but we don't really see that he's having consequences for this because he seems in a pretty stable position. And what this leads me to think is, he can afford to be humble. Even though he's not, extremely rich, he's in a situation unlike Sonia, unlike Raskolnikov, where he can afford to be generous like this.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we really don't know much about his at-home life. We don't know who he has to take care of. He does have parents, which we know that, but we don't know, who he is responsible for. And he also is in a stable mental state. And when you compare that to both Sonia and Raskolnikov, both of them are dealing with their own demons at this time. Raskolnikov, obviously, he's just dealing with so many things, and he's just kind of beyond our scope of understanding. And then Sonia, you can only assume how terrible she feels with doing the very thing that she thinks is so disgusting. And then also, having her mother being dead, which, doesn't happen until the end of the book, but then her father dying, and just so many terrible things. And that, I think, this ties into the idea of Razumikin being one of the only truly happy characters, because can you even really be humble if you're not happy? If being in poverty can turn people sad and bitter, when you're always wanting and needing things, it can be so hard to find joy in even the littlest of things. And that's why Razumikin stands out in this way. And it may not be because he necessarily is better off than Raskolnikov. It's just that in his mind, he can afford to be generous. And I think that's a luxury that we overlook a lot in this book.
At the beginning of this podcast, we talked about the case Miranda v. Arizona and how it related to parts in this book. To learn more about the background and impact of this case, we interviewed American government and history teacher Matt Vallis.
So background of Miranda v. Arizona. So to understand Miranda, you have to understand the Fifth Amendment, all right? And the Fifth Amendment has a variety of clauses within it. Of course, the self-incrimination clause is the one that Miranda is specifically dealing with. But there's some other things in there just to keep in mind, like the due process clause of the Fifth Amendment, which is, of course, life, liberty, property, due process of law. There's also, self-incrimination. When we think of self-incrimination, we think of pleading the fifth, a little bit. There's the grand jury clause. There's the double jeopardy clause. There's a lot of different stuff. But I think honing in on self-incrimination is what Miranda is all about. And I don't think that. I know that. So I would say keep that in mind regarding the Fifth Amendment is like, what is a protection of self-incrimination, and where does the burden lie, right? Like, is the burden on so the Fifth Amendment is like criminal procedure, like, so it's usually for suspects of a crime, right? And then the Fifth Amendment is activated. So in this case, Ernesto Miranda is he's definitely a criminal. He's a bad dude.
Yeah.
And this is taking place in Arizona. I don't recall the specific city, but I think he's convicted of kidnapping and a rape. Basically, he writes out a confession or an acknowledgement that he is confessing, and he's saying, yes, I'm waiving these rights, whatever. But within that written document, there is not a reference to, yes, I'm waiving my right to remain silent and to have counsel. So that's not included within that. So the case is kind of about those two things, and whether that, again, is up for Ernesto Miranda to say, yes, I want this, or is it something that has to be read to him so he knows that it's actually a thing, right? And that's kind of the issue here.
We concluded by asking Matt about the impacts of this case on modern-day society.
About 100 other countries, roughly, have some sort of rule like this. So it's not just unique to the United States, right? Yeah. Which I think emphasizes that it is really important. It was a very radical, controversial change in the 1960s when they initiated this ruling, this landmark ruling. And basically, it was viewed as being like soft on crime, right? Or like anti-police. Yeah. Because now you're taking away the police have to do more, right? And the burden is up to them. But again, the importance is it shows you how valuable like civil liberties are, and the extent by which, like, how challenging it is to take those liberties away from somebody.
As Matt mentioned, some people viewed the ruling on Miranda v. Arizona as too soft on crime. The time period of crime and punishment was hard on people in Russia, and this might explain some of Porfiry's interrogation techniques in the book. When Porfiry is interrogating Raskolnikov, he's really playing mind games with him, and Raskolnikov is getting nervous. He doesn't like it, and we see him get so close to confession. And Raskolnikov at one point even says he doesn't even want to play this kind of game anymore, and he just wants to be arrested or allowed to leave, because he doesn't want to be kind of teased by Porfiry like he is. During the interrogation, Porfiry also says that he thinks that he can always arrest someone, but he wants the suspect to have their own time to think over their crime and what they did, which is really interesting and probably really scares Raskolnikov, because we see him throughout the book having a real issue with this. That Porfiry's technique is really working because Raskolnikov is having such a hard time processing his crime, which is why it seems like he's getting so bothered by these interrogation techniques.
Yeah, definitely. And in talking about the way Raskolnikov struggles, we've talked so much about Raskolnikov's mental health in this book. And I just want to bring back what Matt was saying about civil liberties and how that's really what the Miranda case is all about. And when you think about civil liberties, I mean, they're really talking about liberties granted by the Constitution. Now, obviously, at this time, the Constitution of Russia and the United States were probably vastly different, but a lot of things that are afforded in the United States are rights to health care. And though we are only just now starting to get mental health resources viewed as needed health care, he really didn't have those liberties that would have been granted to him if he might have been alive today. And with all of those things considered, you really have to think, if he had been given the resources that we have in modern day society, would he have turned out as bad as he did? Would he have killed? Would he have lied and committed all these terrible things? Which, you could argue wasn't his fault, but because he wasn't given what we view now as basic rights to be able to function and live, he started this whole journey that we follow in Crime and Punishment. After analyzing these characters and some of the choices they made, there are still so many ideas that could be even further dissected.
Some possible questions for you to think about after listening to this episode are: Raskolnikov clearly wants to be an extraordinary man. Do you think that throughout the book he actually considers himself one? Who do you think is the most miserable character in the story? And what are your thoughts on the multiple attempted confessions that Raskolnikov made and the actual confession at the end?
Ernesto Miranda was not a good person. He committed heinous crimes, but was able to escape punishment, even for a brief period. Today, we talked a lot about morals and how they can give meaning to actions which may seem disagreeable.
When we are presented with characters that have many opposing worldviews and morals, it is easier to see how much they can affect someone and their choices. The lasting sentiment we must take from these assertions is that no matter how distorted someone's worldview is, that cannot excuse them for their actions.
And maybe, after seeing the struggles these characters went through, we can all understand our friends and neighbors a bit better.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Expectation Escapades. We hope this analysis of some of the choices made by characters in Crime and Punishment was thought-provoking and enjoyable. Make sure to subscribe to our podcast so you never miss an episode.
Special thanks to Matt Vallis, Mike Ruddy, Max Collins, and Susanna Nichols for making this episode possible.